I grew up in the sleepy mountain town of Red Elk, nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by ancient forests that seemed to stretch into eternity. Our town's population barely scratched 500, and most of them were old-timers, who lived quiet, reclusive lives in wooden cabins scattered along dirt roads. Everyone knew everyone. That's just how it worked in Red Elk. But there was one part of the forest that no one dared step into after dark: Devil's Pine. The name itself was enough to freeze your blood. A tangle of tall, blackened pine trees, heavy with moss and legend. Every kid in town grew up hearing the stories, passed down like warnings. Don't follow the lantern lights. Don't look into the trees. And whatever you do, don't answer when he calls. I never believed in ghost stories. Not really. I chalked them up to backwoods folklore. That is, until the summer of 2009 when I was 17 and my best friend, Adam, disappeared. Adam was fearless, the kind of guy who would jump off a cliff into a lake just to make you laugh. He and I had been inseparable since we were 5, but even he knew better than to mess with Devil's Pine. At least, that's what I thought. It started innocently. A group of us were hanging out by the fire pit behind my house one night: me, Adam, my cousin Jess, and this guy Kyle from school. We were roasting marshmallows, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey someone had swiped from their dad's cabinet, and talking about nothing in particular. That's when Kyle brought it up. "You guys ever heard of the Lantern Man?" he asked, smirking like a kid who knew he was about to stir the pot. Jess groaned. That old story again. But Kyle kept going. "No, I'm serious. My uncle swears he saw him back in the 80s. Said he wandered off the trail near Devil's Pine. Saw this flickering lantern in the distance, like someone walking ahead of him. Thought it was a ranger or something. But the light kept staying, just far enough out of reach. He followed it for hours until he realized he was lost. Never found his way back until morning. Said he kept hearing whispers in the dark." "Creepy," Adam said, but he was grinning. I rolled my eyes. "Sounds like your uncle was just drunk in the woods." Kyle laughed. "Yeah, maybe. But you know how many people have gone missing in that part of the forest we didn't answer?" We all knew. It was one of those things no one talked about out loud. Later that night, after Jess and Kyle went home, Adam and I sat on the back porch, watching the treetops sway in the breeze. He had that look in his eyes, the one he got when he was about to do something reckless. "You want to go look for the Lantern Man?" he asked, half joking. I scoffed. "Dude, come on." But the next day he was gone. His mom called me around noon, asking if I'd seen him. He hadn't come home. His phone was off. I lied and said I hadn't talked to him since the night before. I didn't want to be the one to tell her he'd mentioned going into Devil's Pine. Not until I knew for sure, I grabbed my flashlight, threw on a jacket, and headed into the woods. I stayed on the old hunter's trail, at first barely visible, through the underbrush, but the deeper I went, the more the world seemed to change. The sounds grew quieter. No birds, no insects, just wind. And trees. So many trees, all leaning in like they were listening. I found his footprints first, then his lighter. It was lying on a patch of moss near the edge of a dry creek bed. That's when I saw it, a light, faint, flickering like a lantern swaying in the dark. My blood went cold. I called out his name, but the forest swallowed my voice. Then the light moved. The lantern swayed gently, bobbing between the thick pine trunks like it was being carried by someone who knew exactly where they were going. I stood frozen for a moment, uncertain whether I was hallucinating or witnessing something real. It couldn't be Adam. He didn't bring a lantern, none of us even owned one. But I told myself maybe he'd found one. Maybe it was a park ranger. Maybe anything except what I feared deep down. I started moving, slowly at first, carefully placing each step on the spongy forest floor, the pine needles muffling my footsteps. I called out again, softer this time. "Adam." The lantern didn't stop. It moved deeper into the trees. No reply. I followed. I don't remember how long I walked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The light never got closer, but it never disappeared. Either always just far enough to tease me, like it wanted me to keep chasing. At one point, I stopped and looked back. Nothing behind me but dark, towering trees. That's when I realized I'd gone off trail. Way off. I cursed under my breath, and took a few steps back the way I came. But I couldn't find my own footprints. It was like the forest had swallowed them up. I turned back toward the light. It was gone. Panic gripped me like a noose tightening around my chest. I spun in a circle, flashlight beam swinging wildly over, bark and brambles, nothing, no sound, no movement, and then the whispering. It was soft at first, like wind rustling through dry leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct, a chorus of voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. It came from all around me. I couldn't tell if it was in the trees, the ground, or inside my own skull. I squeezed my eyes shut and shouted, "Stop!" Silence. I opened my eyes and nearly dropped the flashlight. Standing not 10 feet in front of me was a figure, dressed in black, long coat, wide-brimmed hat, holding a lantern. Its face was shadowed, but I could see the mouth smiling. The man didn't move. Neither did I. My brain screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped in place by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. The lantern's flame flickered inside a glass casing, casting long, jagged shadows over his coat. The whispering began again. But now I could tell it was coming from him. He raised his arm slowly, the lantern rising with it, and then he turned. Without a sound, he walked into the trees, and I followed. I don't know why I didn't want to. I was terrified, but it was like some invisible thread had been tied around my chest and was pulling me forward. I followed the glow, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the only sound in the suffocating silence. At some point, the trees began to change. They grew thicker, the branches more twisted, like claws reaching down to snag me. The light around me dimmed, but not because of the setting sun. It was still midday. It was like the forest itself was darkening. Eventually the man stopped. We stood in a small clearing. In the center was a tree stump, and on Itadam's backpacker rushed forward, grabbing it with trembling hands. It was his. I recognized the band stickers he'd glued to the flap, but it was soaked. Not with rain. Something thicker, stickier. I didn't want to look too closely when I turned around. The lantern man was gone. The whispering returned, louder now, angry, accusatory. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over a root, and took off running. Branches whipped at my face. My lungs burned. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed on the forest floor, sobbing and gasping for air. That's where the search party found me. I was 3 miles from Devil's Pine. No trail, no landmarks. Just collapsed in the dirt, clutching atoms, backpacked like a lifeline. I told the cops he'd gone hiking alone, and I tried to find him. Left out the part about the lantern man. Who would believe it? They searched the woods for weeks. Found nothing. Not even bones. Adam was declared legally dead 2 years later. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I walk past the edge of Devil's Pine on cold, quiet nights, I see the lantern again, still swaying, still smiling, still waiting. I never believed in curses. My parents did. My grandparents even more so, but me. I believed in logic, reason, the kind of truths you could hold in your hands and explain with facts. That changed during the fall of 2016, when I took a job cataloging plant life deep in a stretch of Appalachian forest known locally as the Green Hollow. I was working for a private conservation firm hired by the state. The project sounded simple: identify local flora and mark any endangered species. I was excited. It meant solitude, camping, and a break from city noise. I didn't know then that Green Hollow was more than just a valley. It was a wound in the earth, and something ancient was still whispering from inside it. I arrived at the ranger station just outside the forest's boundary a day before my assignment officially began. The place was oddly quiet for late October. The trees were ablaze in red and gold, leaves carpeting the trails like spilled fire. But the locals I met at the diner that evening warned me with the same old tone. I'd heard growing up in superstitious towns, "You be careful in them woods." Now, the waitress said as she refilled my coffee, especially round the hollow, chuckled politely. "Why's that?" She leaned in. "Voices at night, they say they belong to the trees." I nodded, smiled, and didn't press further. I'd heard enough old tales in my life to know not to mock them to someone's face. The next morning, I hiked in with my gear. No cell service, but I had an emergency satellite device, a backpack full of supplies, and a solid plan. I'd set up camp at the edge of the hollow, collect samples during the day, log them on my laptop, and check in every few days via radio. The first 3 days were uneventful. I moved along the ridgelines, collected fungi, photographed wildflowers, and mapped out patches of moss and lichen. The only strange thing I noted was the silence. The deeper I moved into the valley, the fewer sounds I heard. No birdsong, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hush the further I went. It wasn't until the 4th night that I heard it. I'd been sitting near my tent, writing notes by headlamp, when the whisper came soft, like a breath brushing across my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. I stood up slowly, every part of me alert. "Hello." I called out. Silence. I swept my flashlight across the trees, but all I saw was bark and branches. Then the whisper came again, closer. It wasn't words exactly, just syllables, a sound that wanted to be language. I turned off the lamp and held my breath. From the shadows between the trees, a voice whispered again, low, elongated. It felt ancient, like the forest itself was trying to speak through dry, cracked lips. Then I saw them. Eyes, at least half a dozen, glinting from the underbrush, not animal eyes. There were 2, level, 2 intelligent, and they didn't blink. I backed into my tent and zipped it shut with shaking hands. I didn't sleep that night, just sat with a knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, staring at the fabric walls while those whispers circled my camp like wolves. By morning they were gone, but the forest felt different, wrong. Still, I kept working. Told myself I was imagining things. Sleep deprived, maybe a fever, but something was shifting in that forest. My compass started malfunctioning. Moss grew on the wrong side of trees. Even the sun seemed slower to rise in that place. Time dragged differently in the hollow. On day 6, I found the stone. It sat in the middle of a clearing I hadn't mapped before, though I was sure I'd walked that path twice. The stone was tall, maybe 7 feet, and covered in deep spiraling grooves. It hummed faintly, a low vibration I could feel in my teeth. Carved around its base were symbols I didn't recognize, not runes, not pictographs, more like scars, and surrounding it, in a perfect circle, were bones. Small, animal, mostly, some not. I took a single photo. The minute the shutter clicked, the forest exhaled. That's the only way I can describe it. A windless gust, strong enough to rattle leaves, and push me back. I turned and ran. When I reached camp, my gear was scattered. My tent was torn. The laptop I'd locked inside a sealed case was open, its screen cracked down the center, and scratched into the aluminum shell. In letters I recognized but couldn't read were the same symbols from the stone. I didn't sleep that night either. Instead, I listened. The voices didn't whisper anymore. They sang. Not in any tongue I knew, but in a harmony that churned my stomach. Low, droning tones that vibrated through my ribs. I heard footsteps that didn't belong to any man or animal. I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line watching. Motionless. On the 8th day I tried to leave, took the trail north, retracing my route by GPS, but the deeper I moved, the more the path changed. Trees I'd marked were gone. Landmarks had shifted. Time warped. I walked for hours and ended up back at the stone. That night, I dreamt I stood in a forest with no sky. Branches formed a ceiling, roots pulsed beneath my feet, and in front of me stood something tall, robed in moss and bone, with no face. Just a gaping black cavity where its head should have been. It raised one arm and pointed to my chest. I woke up screaming. The final entry in my field journal reads, "The forest is learning my name." I don't remember being rescued. According to search and rescue, I was found nearly 10 miles from where I should have been, half naked, dehydrated, clutching my broken satellite phone and whispering to a tree stump. I spent 3 weeks in psychiatric observation. No one believed me. Not fully. They blamed stress, hallucinations, exposure. But I know what I heard. The forest knows things. It holds things, ancient, forgotten things. And sometimes, if it likes you, it whispers back. If you grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania, you probably heard stories about Hollow Creek Trail. They were passed around like folklore campfire tales for kids, warnings for hikers. It wasn't an official trail, not anymore. According to maps, it had been closed off in the late 1970s after a massive landslide, but locals knew it was still there, winding through the dense forest like an artery that had been severed. They also knew the stories. People going missing, campers never returning, strange lights, strange sounds. I always thought it was just backwoods myth. Something to keep kids from wandering off too far. That is, until my brother disappeared there. In the fall of 2013. His name was Corey. He was 26, a natural outdoorsman, more at home in the woods than in his own apartment. That October, he set off on a solo hike along Hollow Creek, insisting he'd be back in 3 days. He never returned. I was the one who found his car, parked at the edge of the forest near an old metal gate covered in vines. There were no footprints leading into the woods, just silence, thick and heavy, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The authorities searched for 6 days. Nothing, not even a shred of fabric. They eventually called it off, citing possible animal attack or misadventure. But I couldn't let it go. Corey was careful, experienced. Something happened out there, and I needed to know what. So I went in after him. It was early November when I entered Hollow Creek. The air had turned bitter, and the wind hissed through the trees like a warning. I carried a backpack with food, water, a flashlight, and a handheld camcorder, my one stupid attempt at documenting whatever I found. I also carried Corey's old hunting knife, just in case. The trail started out as expected, overgrown but navigable. Fallen logs, creeping vines, and a blanket of dead leaves crunching beneath my boots. But after about an hour of hiking, I noticed something odd. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, not even the usual creaking of tree limbs. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That's when I saw the tree. It stood alone in the center of a clearing, taller than the rest, bark blackened like it had been burned. Carved into its trunk were dozens of names, some fresh, some faded by time. And at the base of the tree, buried under a pile of leaves, was a shoe. I recognized it. Corey's hiking boot, laces still tied. I dropped to my knees and began searching. Dug through the leaves with frantic hands, calling his name, hoping stupidly that he was nearby. All I found was a piece of cloth, torn and stained. It was part of his jacket. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched tone, faint, like a ringing. In my ears I looked up, but the sky above the clearing was suddenly darker, like clouds had rolled in without warning. I checked my watch. It was only 2:15 p.m., but it felt like dusk. I started walking again, faster now, heart pounding. That's when the forest began to change. I know how that sounds crazy, but the trees were different, closer together. Their shapes twisted unnaturally. Some were bent at impossible angles, like they'd grown sideways, then straight up. The trail beneath me warped to once a dirt path, now muddy, soft, and full of deep hoof-like impressions that didn't belong to any animal I knew. I saw something move ahead of me, a shadow quick and tall slipping between the trees. I called. But Corey, no response. I chased it. Branches slapped my face, roots caught my boots, but I kept going, convinced it had to be him. The trail narrowed, funneled me into a narrow ravine where the light barely reached the floor. That's when I heard the breathing, not mine, something else. Ragged, wet. I raised my flashlight and swept it around, and I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the beam. Pale, hairless eyes sunken and too wide. Its limbs were long and naturally sewn. Its mouth hung open like it had forgotten how to close. It didn't move. It just watched. I took a step back. It mirrored me. I turned and ran. I don't remember how long I ran. I only remember falling down a slope into a ditch full of dead leaves and bones. Dozens of bones, human, animals mixed together like they'd been tossed in a pile. I scrambled out, slipping in the mud, and saw symbols carved into the rocks around the ditch. Crude, looping lines like something a child would draw with trembling hands. They pulsed faintly in the dark. That's when I heard my brother's voice. Eli, it whispered, help me. I turned. Nothing. Then it came again. Eli, it was coming from deeper in the ravine. I followed it. The terrain shifted. Again. I swear it did. The trees leaned inward, branches forming archways overhead. Moss grew in spirals, and the light, what little there was, flickered like firelight. Though there was no flame dot at the center of the spiral grove, I found Corey's backpack, propped upright against a tree, perfectly intact. The camcorder in my hand clicked on by itself. I didn't press anything. Through the lens, I saw the truth. The forest wasn't empty. Shapes flickered in and out of focus. Figures clung to the trees like insects, human-shaped but wrong, crawling upside down, their joints bending backward. They watched me through the lens, but when I lowered it, they were gone. Then the whispering started. Not voices, more like memories. My memories. Things I hadn't thought about in years. Arguments with Corey, regrets, my father's funeral. My own face, crying at age 7. It was like the forest was inside my mind, rummaging through drawers. I screamed, the forest screamed back. That's the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up 2 days later in the hospital. A hunter had found me, stumbling out of the forest, barefoot, bloodied, and muttering my brother's name over and over. The doctors said I was suffering from shock, dehydration, exposure. They never found Corey, not a trace, but I know he's still there, somewhere in that place that doesn't follow rules, where time twists and memory is a weapon. And sometimes, late at night, I hear him whisper my name again. I first heard about Maplefog Forest in a forgotten blog from 2004, a single post buried deep in a dead forum for amateur urban explorers. The user, anonymous and long gone, claimed to have stumbled across a hidden village deep in the Vermont wilderness. No maps showed it, no Google results. Just a name scratched into an old wooden sign, Winther's End. The post described abandoned cabins, hollow-eyed statues made of woven branches, and something about voices that follow you home. It should have been a creepypasta, and I would have dismissed it, if not for one detail. One of the photographs the user uploaded showed a hand-carved pendant. I recognized it. My grandfather used to wear the same one. After he died, we found almost nothing about his early life. He never spoke of his childhood, only that he grew up in a place best left forgotten. My father said he came down from Vermont, but the specifics always vanished in smoke. I became obsessed. I scoured every public record, library, archive, and old newspaper in that region. Nothing about a village called Winther's End, but I had the pendant. And now I had a location. I took a week off from work, packed light, and drove to Vermont. I parked near an unmarked Forest Service road in the Green Mountains and hiked in. Fog hung low across the forest floor like the name promised. It wasn't just mist, it felt thick, intelligent, like it was watching. On the second day I found the trail. It wasn't carved or paved, just an unnatural clearing of earth winding between trees. The grass didn't grow on it. The trees alongside it bent inward, as though leaning to listen. I walked it anyway. After 5 more hours, the forest opened into a clearing. There it was, a village, silent, timeless. About 15 buildings surrounded a dried-up well. They were wooden, rotted in places, covered in moss and ivy. Chimneys stood crumbled. Doors swung half open on rusted hinges. It looked untouched by human hands for at least 50 years, but it didn't feel abandoned. Something in the air pulsed like the heartbeat of the place hadn't stopped, just slowed. I explored the largest cabin first. Inside were broken furniture, a smashed lantern, and hundreds of handwritten papers nailed to the walls. Prayers or warnings. They weren't in English. Some words looked like twisted Latin. Others were symbols, sharp spirals, and jagged loops etched into parchment, wood, even skin. In the corner I found a child's toy, a straw doll with button eyes and a sawn-shut mouth. The moment I touched it, I heard footsteps above me. I turned. The ceiling was collapsing in places. No one could have walked up there, but the footsteps continued. Measured. Heavy. I backed out of the cabin, heart hammering. That's when I noticed the others' figures, shrouded in fog, standing between buildings, watching, still as statues. I couldn't make out their faces, only the shape of them. Human, but wrong. One of them tilted its head. Another raised an arm as if to wave or beckon. I ran, didn't stop until I was deep in the trees again, lungs aching. I told myself I imagined it. Hallucination, fog tricks. But the next morning when I woke up, there were fresh footprints outside my tent. Barefoot, too large to be mine. I should have left, but I went back. This time, I carried a camera hoping to document everything. But the moment I stepped into the village again, it changed. The buildings were different. Some were repaired. Smoke rose from one chimney. A distant bell chimed at. It wasn't abandoned anymore. I stood frozen. Was I losing my mind? That's when I heard the singing, high and childlike, echoing from within the largest cabin. A girl's voice, humming a melody I somehow knew but couldn't place. I stepped toward it. The door creaked open before I touched it. Inside stood a woman. Her face was soft, pale, and her eyes were sewn shut with black thread, yet she looked at me. "Come home," she whispered. I ran again. But the forest had changed. Paths looped into themselves. Trees shifted when I wasn't looking. The air grew colder, thicker. I walked in circles for hours. Every time I stopped, the fog grew closer. At night I heard laughter, children playing, my grandfather's voice whispering lullabies he used to hum. I tried using my compass. It spun uselessly. On the third day, I returned to the village by accident. The well was uncovered now, its stones clean. Something inside it whispered. I felt pulled hip. I leaned over. Far below, in the black water, I saw a face. Mine. But it wasn't blinking. It smiled. I dropped the camera and ran again. My final memory is collapsing against a tree, shaking, surrounded by whispering voices I couldn't locate. One voice, louder than the rest, said, "You can leave, but the village won't." I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Rescue teams found me on a rural road 20 miles away from where I started. No sign of the pendant. No camera. Nothing in my bag. I asked them if they'd found the village. They hadn't, according to every satellite and GPS map. Nothing exists in that forest except trees and rocks. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the humming again, and I know that one day, no matter how far I run, winter's end will find me again. I didn't believe the stories until I saw it for myself. The forest that grows people isn't on any map, and it's not the kind of place you stumble into by accident. It finds you. That's how it was for me. I was working on a soil analysis project for an environmental research group in Oregon, doing routine assessments of fungal biodiversity in old-growth regions. My job was to take samples, photograph patterns, record climate data that changed the day we were assigned a parcel, known only by its old forestry code MH Vinci Trace. The locals had another name for it. The breeding wood. They never said it with humor. They whispered it like a confession, eyes darting away like the trees might hear. Our team was small for people. Myself, Lena, our botanist, Raj, the tech specialist, and Mason, our field lead. We had a 2-week permit, enough time to collect data and survey the area. We camped on the edge of the forest, where the moss grew so thick it looked like carpet and every tree creaked like it was breathing. From the first step into the forest, things were wrong. The canopy was so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground, casting everything in a sickly green hue. The temperature dropped by 10 degrees the deeper we went, and the air felt wet, not humid, but wet. Like we were moving through lungs rather than air. And the silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. On our second day, Lena noticed something strange in a patch of ferns. It looked like a root at first, twisted brown and half buried. But when she brushed it off, we saw it clearly. It was a finger, human, grown out of the earth. Its nail cracked, the skin barked like, connected to a hand, connected to an arm. The soil parted like a zipper, revealing what looked like an entire human form lying beneath, wrapped in tendrils like veins. It wasn't a body, it was growing. Raj screamed. Mason threw up. I just stared. Something about it felt true. Like I'd always known forests could do this if they wanted. Lena touched it. Its eyes opened. They were green, milky and unblinking. We called it in 2 base. They told us to mark the site and return, but by the time we went back the next day, it was gone. The earth was smooth again, untouched. No sign it had ever been there. That's when things got worse. We started hearing footsteps at night. Not animal. Scurrying human pacing. Slow, heavy, circling our tents. Mason stayed up one night with a camera. He caught something on infrared. Tall figures standing just beyond the trees. Completely still. Too tall. One of them moved forward. Then the footage cut out. We found his camera the next morning, hanging from a branch 15 feet off the ground. On day 6, Raj went missing. We woke to find his tent slashed open from the inside. No blood, no struggle, just his boots, carefully placed at the tent's edge, as if he'd stepped out of himself. We searched for hours. That night, we found him, or what was left of him, in a clearing not marked on our maps. There stood a circle of trees, all twisted inwards. At their base, tangled in vines and half embedded in bark, was Roger's face, just his face. Stretched thin, fused to the trunk like wallpaper. His mouth was open in a scream, his eyes wide, though there was no life in them. Lena fainted. I almost did too. Mason wanted to leave immediately, I agreed. But the forest didn't single quotes our GPS spun. The compass pointed south no matter where we turned. Paths curved back into themselves. Trees we marked with tape were found unmarked hours later. The forest was changing around us. Adapting. Feeding. Mason tried to hike out alone the next morning. He left with half our gear and a flare gun. We found his flare that night burning in the sky straight above us. He never came back. On day 10, Lena stopped speaking. She would sit at the edge of camp, staring at the trees, mouth open like she was listening to something we couldn't hear. Her skin turned pale, then greenish, veins darkened. I caught her once digging into the soil with her bare hands, whispering something over and over. "They're in the roots. They're in the roots." I begged her to stop, but she just smiled and said, "It's okay. They grow beautiful things here." That night, she disappeared. I found her boots neatly placed by the stream. A patch of moss nearby had a strange bump beneath it. I didn't check. I was alone. For 3 more days, I wandered. The forest grew quieter. I saw shapes between trees, long-limbed shadows with faces like wood. They didn't follow, they waited. I stopped sleeping, started seeing my teammates walking beside me, only to blink and see empty woods. On the final morning, I found the tree. Massive, thick roots. Its trunk was lined with human faces, hundreds of them, frozen in expressions of peace, or horror, or confusion. One of them was Lena. Her eyes moved just once. I collapsed. When I woke, I was on the side of a forest road, barely able to stand, bleeding from my palms, my shirt torn. A truck driver picked me up. I don't know how I got out. I don't know why I was let go. The organization I worked for disavowed the entire mission, said it was a paperwork error. There is no record of MH23A anymore, but I have the footage, have the pendant Lena carved for me the night before she vanished, made of bark and hair. Sometimes I dream of roots wrapping around my legs, pulling me into the dirt, whispering growl. The forest doesn't kill you, it reaps you.